I'm Philippe Kern. I'm acting here as a chairman of the B.CREATIVE network. But I'd like also to introduce our guest speaker, Uri Adoni, as well as our two interveners, Laoura Ntziourou, as well as Sergiu Ardelean. So the idea is to have initially a conversation, a dialogue with Uri, and sharing his experience as venture capitalist supporting startups. That he actually shared his experience in a book, The Unstoppable Startup. And then after this conversation, have a reactions from Sergiu, who just launched 2 years ago a company in virtual reality, augmented reality in Austria, as well as Laoura, who is working for the European Investment Fund on supporting startups and SMEs in the creative industries. But I'd like to start with Uri and Uri Adoni. And Uri has we met Uri actually, was it 3 years ago at an event, at the first B.CREATIVE event that we hosted in Namur in Belgium. And Uri is an interesting person in the sense that he had he didn't mention it earlier and when we were preparing, but he had some experience in the military in Israel. But he developed his experience first with Microsoft, heading the company there in Israel for a few years. But also we invited him more specifically to share his experience on funding startups, especially in Israel, in particular in the high-tech sector. He's a partner in a famous and very large venture capital fund in Israel, and we thought that it would be interesting to get his opinion and sharing experience in working with startups in a specific context, the context of Israel, which is known as a startup nation. And I would like to ask Uri, without any further ado, the first questions, which would be, I found his book very, very interesting and very enlightening, The Unstoppable Startup. And in particular, whether for high-tech or culture and creative operators, the title, which was, how you move from your dreams to operational. And I'd like to start, Uri, with this question: is what in your view is the main message of your book? Very, very rapidly.
So thank you, Phil. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I think actually it's the whole book started in a way, the idea, when I was giving a talk in a high-tech conference at the time. And when I was done with the talk, somebody from the crowd, there were some Q&As, and they asked me, how can I tweet it? How can I put your 30 minutes of presentation into 280 characters? And he said, yeah, we've heard, you talked about Israel and how it's like the second largest hub in the world after the Silicon Valley, and highest startups per capita, highest venture capital per capita, but how can I squeeze it into a tweet? And that actually was a good question. He got me thinking, and eventually I told him, I think that if we narrow it down to a tweet, I would say that it's all about chutzpah. And that's kind of, again, you're asking me to narrow it down to a sentence. So in a way, I think that there are other ecosystems around the world. There are other places where you have funding. There are other places where you have startups and technologies and talented people creating companies. But I think what differentiates, if I need to kind of put a finger on it, and this is actually what the book is about, is actually a cultural element, which in Hebrew is called chutzpah, which is kind of, I'm not sure there's a translation, but it's about audacity, being bold, go to approach. It has, by the way, a negative aspect and a positive one. So I'm obviously focusing on the positive. The negative one is maybe being arrogant or or rude, but I'm addressing the positive sides, which is mainly a mindset. So I think that the main message, if I have to narrow it down, is that at the end of the day, if you're an entrepreneur, and it doesn't matter if it's a tech entrepreneur, it's a cultural entrepreneur, it's an artist, uh, any entrepreneurship, the way I see it, has to challenge reality and challenge the status quo. So, and this is kind of the heart of chutzpah. You're saying, in a way, the way you're looking at the world is saying, yeah, this has been existing for a while, but I think I can do it better. I think I can build a better solution. I think I can build a better technology. I think I can, look at it from a different artistic angle. Um, and I think that there's always room to challenge reality. There's always room to challenge the status quo. And so I would say that's kind of the main message. In a way, there's more messages than just that. We can expand in a minute, but the main message is it's about a mindset of challenging whatever as the reality.
Because what's interesting, Uri, in your book is the fact that you are actually highlighting some kind of cultural drivers that are specific to the country you are coming from, Israel, but that actually can be specific in different countries. And the drivers, as you mentioned, are this kind of grit, or this kind of assertiveness that exists in Israel among Israeli people, and what you characterize as the chutzpah. Then you also, what I liked also is this reference to your experience in the military, which is also a strong cultural characteristic of your country. And maybe the third one is this multinational state of mind. Can you elaborate on this and in relation to supporting entrepreneurship?
Sure. I actually start with the reference you made to the army, because I think it's highly relevant for entrepreneurship from a certain angle. Many people think when they think about armies, they think about you have to follow orders. That's the most important thing. And even though it's important in the Israeli army, it's not the most important thing. The only important thing in the Israeli army is a simple thing called complete the mission. This is it. And as you mentioned, I was a commander of a combat unit for quite a few years. And one of the things that you are being trained for is actually not necessarily to follow the plan, because the plans always change. If you're in combat, nothing you've planned always acts as you planned it. There's always unplanned occasions. And so the way you're being trained is actually to be creative, to improvise, to come up with solutions. And the whole drill is built in a way, they tell you, okay, you're here now, you don't have that ammunition. Okay, the thing that you were supposed to do at night, there's a bad weather, now you have to do it in the day, etc. So the whole drill, you have to improvise and come up with solutions when you have one thing in your mind, and this is completing the mission. This is the most important and probably the only things that matter. Now, the reasons it is relevant for startups and I think any entrepreneur is that when you have it, it's about a mindset. If you kind of adopt this completing the mission mindset, it's a very powerful concept, because then you are not necessarily committed to a certain plan or to a certain, I don't know, route that you had in mind, but rather to how do I complete this mission? And again, in high tech, I see it in many companies, Israeli ones for that matter, that they would fly. I had a company that the CEO had this good call with Amazon. The next day he went on a plane, he got on a plane, flew to Seattle, which is, I don't know, 17, 18-hour flight, went physically to meet the person because he thought that was the most important thing, that the mission, and he came back the day after, and that was actually successful because they managed to close the deal. So in a way, I think working nights, working weekends, whatever needs to be done in order to complete the mission. So I think, again, it's a cultural mindset thing that that I think that one should have. And this is combined. This is connects to your other comment about the internationalism or globalism of a startup, or again any kind of entrepreneurship. I think that as a startup, definitely as a technology startup, you should think global from day one. And what it means to think global is that you look at the competitive analysis and the competition on a global level, not only on the local level. The benchmark for your solution should be an international one, not just a local one. And you should be thriving or aiming to actually dominate the category that you're in, and thus be a category leader in an international level. Again, from a venture capital perspective, when you are a category leader, the value of the company is obviously very high. Whether you do an exit or an M&A or an IPO, it doesn't matter. The valuation of the company is very important. But I think as a business, also, if you should aim high, not just on the local level. And again, it doesn't matter if you're a technology business or any other business. I think that the global mindset is a very important one, and preferably should be part of the DNA of the company from inception.
I think also what characterizes Israel is it's a small market in effect, with not a big population. So it corresponds to a lot of markets in the European Union context, where companies obviously have to be successful locally in the cultural and creative sector, but have to think globally because they evolve in a market that is very much international. And we get a lot of requests of how to access international market when you are in fashion, when you are in music, when you are in film, and so on. And there is a bit something depressing in your book, in the sense that you're mentioning that in order to be successful you have to go to Silicon Valley because this is where you are going to raise finance. So can you reassure us a little bit that it's possible also to do it in the European context?
No, I'm not saying you need to go to Silicon Valley. I think that I mentioned that the US is usually the default market for startups, and when you want to scale in a global level, US investors are helpful. But New York, Boston, Miami, Denver, there's a lot of other places that you can actually place your startup in. But that's not always the case. So I think that, as you mentioned, the Israeli case is very clear because we have a very small market. We're only 9 million people. And so any company that wants to be large or scale needs to go outside Israel. In our case, usually the US is the default market because, again, if you manage to kind of become a leader in the category in the US, then you have a good chance to become a worldwide leader. Where in Europe, it's more challenging because it's one continent, but it's not one country. So you actually need to, you have to have multi-language solution. You have to have kind of offices around different countries in Europe. So Europe, I guess, it's a bit more challenging to expand to. Having said that, we always look at European markets, and there are some specific verticals like fintech and sometimes the biotech, the medical devices, these kind of things that are actually going to Europe as the first market. I do think that startups or companies, or whether it's technology, fashion, music, when they are in Europe, I happen to travel quite a lot in Europe as well, and I've seen kind of two kind of entrepreneurs in Europe. One kind is a very local-minded entrepreneurs that are looking at the market. Their product is very targeting the local market, whether it's a cultural thing, whether it's a technology thing, whether it's a UI solution or whatever, and they're focusing usually on their local country, and their kind of expansion plan is usually linear. So they say, okay, I'll start with my city, actually, then I'll go to my country, then maybe I'll expand to other countries in Europe, and maybe in whatever 6, 7, 8 years I'll expand to the rest of the world. The other kind, which I I tend to support more is the ones who are looking at the world from day one and say, okay, tactically, I want to test my product in the local market, which is good, just to make sure that I got it right. But then once I understand I got it right and I made all the necessary tweaks and changes, then I go globally, not after 8 years, but after like, I don't know, 18 months. So and it, you know, it needs funding, it needs a plan, it needs to make sure that you do have some kind of a competitive advantage. But you should look at the world, because if you're looking to kind of rule some kind of or dominate a market, if you won't do it, somebody else will. And then if somebody else got this hill, you won't be able to conquer it. So the sooner you do it, the more chances you have to actually get this leadership position that I think a company should strive to.
Uri, maybe this is my last question before we open to our two guest interveners. You very much insist on the importance of public policy in setting up the creative ecosystem, and you gave examples of what happened in Israel in getting together universities with the tech, but also the creative industries, and actually also this environment in which tech is mixed with creative sectors as part of your activities in a real estate business. I think this is important to highlight. So I'd like you to share your experience in the importance of building a creative ecosystems to support entrepreneurship.
Sure. So I think that if you look at, again, the Israeli case, we had the opportunity to build a few local ecosystems here in Israel. And part of the idea, again, we're coming from the tech, but the concept is very similar. So usually there are 6 pillars, I would say, to any good performing ecosystem. One is the talent. And so talent, it's not just engineers or not just, designers. You need entrepreneurial talent. You need people that want to start companies, to start initiatives. So that's very important. The other thing is funding. So whether you're self-funded or you are, there's a VC behind you, angel funding or government funding, doesn't matter. But funding is very important, because this is kind of the fuel that any company needs in the first couple of years before it gets into revenues. Preferably should be a multi-stage funding, all the way from pre-seed to seed, A/B rounds, and later stage. Then there are in the business side, there are the corporates, and preferably the multinationals. In Israel, we have like almost, 400. So all the way from Google and Apple and IBM and Huawei and Siemens. So you name it, they're here one way or another. And this interaction with them is very important, because they are the market. So they can tell us as investors or us as a market and the entrepreneurs what the market needs and what it will need in 2, 3, 4 years time. The fourth pillar is the government, and again, it's always a sensitive topic, the government. But if it's built in the right way, it can be a really good support to entrepreneurs. In Israel, there's quite a few programs that supports early stage entrepreneurs, that gives all sorts of tax incentives to investors, to multinationals to come over. There's about almost $600 million that are injected into R&D in companies every year through the Innovation Authority, and so the government has an important role. The university, as you mentioned, the academia, there's a lot of brains and smart people coming out there, and obviously the students that are the next generation of the entrepreneurs. And lastly, the sixth one is the cultural kind of the entrepreneurial culture. And I think that when you look at a vibrant ecosystem, it's never just about high tech. It's never just about, a vertical. It's always, again, the way we built it was there is the fund, there is the startups, but there's always restaurants, and there's a performing art center, and there are nightclubs and hotels. So you have the whole, there's a renovation of the whole old train station in Jerusalem, not just next to our premises. So all these things are making I think the ecosystem much more creative and much more diverse, and a multidisciplinary one. And I mentioned earlier to you that I was working for the last couple of years with a real estate developer that decided to actually dedicate the real estate to these ecosystems, and the concept of combining arts and tech uh, and and service providers and designers and even story writers to some extent. So all these kind of things for gaming, for example, this makes a lot of sense when you create this ecosystem, and when it works together, it really does click in a way that, you know, 1 + 1 not only, it's not only equals 3, I guess it equals 11 in a way. So it's a very powerful thing when you have this ecosystem uh, in a diverse manner and in a multidisciplinary kind of, with a multidisciplinary approach.
Thanks, Uri. I stop on this part of the webinar, and I think I give the floor to Clémentine, who is ending the
Yes,
next one.
actually, I am going to give the floor to our two Be Creative friends who've joined us tonight for this discussion. So maybe starting with Sergiu. Sergiu, so you're the co-founder of the app Artivive. And you've recently raised some funding. So maybe to hear from you, from your experience as a creative entrepreneur at the verge of tech and culture and the arts, how your experience relates to what Uri just presented.
Thank you very much. I hope that everything works and you can see me.
Yes, we can see you, we can hear you and your
great
background.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation and being able to be here and listening to Uri. It's very interesting to learn from his experience and seeing how similar it is and it was to what we are doing, and how this startup ecosystem also in Europe and Israel, but also in California, where I spent the last year, is very similar, but different at the same time. And I think being in the creative space makes it a little bit more difficult because many VCs and there where the money is something that is maybe not so tangible as maybe fintech, where it's clear that the numbers are talking for the success of a product. It's more in the creative space, something that maybe takes some time and some years. And I think that's also great. Good part to be in the European Union and in Austria, especially. I'm in Vienna because there are some funds helping these startups and entrepreneurs which are in the creative space. Because in some cases it's not necessarily a VC case, because being in the creative space, it somehow has a lot of changing the way how people are thinking, also in the way that we are doing with augmented reality, bringing technology and culture and arts together. In maybe if we are looking at museums and institutions in a market of people who are doing the same thing over many decades. And we see that the public and we and everybody needs to move forward and have a way to interact with this content and also have a refreshed experience. But the people who are taking the decisions are maybe not so willing to move forward. So I think this is, in our case, working with these institutions, a little bit the downside, or where we have to put a little bit more effort. Sometimes it's not easy. I think being an entrepreneur in general is not easy. And I have some notes that I made from the points that Uri said. So most important is the mindset. So the moment that you're going after an idea and you have the mindset that you're on the right path and you want to change, and you will hear a lot of no's and a lot of this will never work. But if you have the mindset to challenging it, to change the reality, the status quo, So like Uri said, is the only way that you can move forward. So I think it's from the beginning, when you have an idea, it should, or a project that you want to do, in general as a startup, and also in the creative industries, you have to be very, very obsessed almost of the idea to push it through. And this is also the way how things are changing, right? Because people unfortunately are reluctant to change, and startups are exactly doing that, changing the status quo. So I think it's a very important part of the mindset, but it's something that you can also train, I would say. And I think another very important part that Uri said is completing the mission, which we, in a way or the other, had the same approach. We just called it a different different way. We called it the North Star. So we, from the beginning, set the North Star. So the way that we are working, it's a lean way. So that means that we're trying to find and define the smallest steps that we can take in the shortest amount of time to get a result. Our output shouldn't be perfect. It should be fast. But we should have a North Star. So we should know which direction we're moving, what do we want to achieve. And I will give you an example. When we were in California at an accelerator, in order to move forward and use the potential that we had to the accelerator, we had to adapt to the infrastructure, or the way how the startups are working in California. So for them, it was growth. It's like you have to be, if a startup, you do everything for growth. So for us, the North Star was getting artists on board. And following this mission, it was really easy, because everything that we did, from development, marketing, operations, financing, it was the question, does it help us to reach the North Star? Is it something that it helps us to go further to what we want? And having this clear vision, it makes everything much easier. Because then also you know what you're working for. It's much easier to take decisions what makes sense or not in the pursuit that you have. And it's also much easier to sell the idea, because that's the part where we had a hard time in California, because talking to most VCs and also angel investors were like, why art? There is no money in art. And on the other hand, we were like, yes, but art is changing the society. Art is holding a mirror to the society. Art is what makes us human. That's why art. And then explaining, but look, we managed to, in 3 months, to get 50,000 artists on board, and they're creating. And then you had the attention. So we also had a construct to easily sell the idea, because most of the times the idea also of a startup has so many layers that as a founder you get lost in these layers, and you try to show how many possibilities are there, also to VCs, to angels, to people that will help you with the funding. But it's very hard for them to follow that. So it's also easier to find one idea that you can sell and say, okay, we are the augmented reality platform for art. We'll change how art is created and consumed. It's something that people can somehow grasp and understand, that it has so many layers. It's clear that we have different markets and different players and stakeholders. It's clear, but if you get these questions, then you already have the attention. So that helps you a lot. So that was the way how we managed to raise a round in Corona time some months ago. I don't know if I answered your questions, because
yes, Sergiu, may I interrupt you 2 seconds, because you mentioned the initial funding in Austria, which is very strong in Europe. The initial funding, the next stage funding seems to be more of a problem. And we are talking about the creative ecosystem. When we met actually in Seoul in South Korea at an event, and following this event, you got funding from Asia, you got funding from the US, from the United States, and more business angels or venture capital funding. So I'd like to ask you your experience in dealing with financial institution, venture capital in Europe. Do you find them a bit more reluctant, less more difficult to convince?
So I think it's like very important to know to whom you're talking and which are their interests. So for example, the funding that we got from California was through the accelerator program. We got into the accelerator program, which was part of a university, because I think that we put the perspective for them to also as a university invest and look in startups for culture and arts, and not only machine learning and Bitcoin and blockchain, raised the interest. On the other hand, when we are getting funding from the city of Vienna, is showing the projects that we're doing with the institutions here. When we're getting funding from Austria, is showing them how Austria can become a hotspot for bringing both culture and technology together, because this is what Austria stands for. It's the future, and it's also the heritage and the culture that we have here with the whole institutions, museums, operas, and so on. So I think it's very important to know to who you pitch, and not necessarily, at least in the creative sector, to stick to the PDF slides, to the PowerPoint slides, but try to find the way how you can package it so it's interesting to find the interest on the other side where the money is.
Great, thanks a lot, Sergiu. If anyone has questions, yeah, please don't hesitate to put it up in the chat. We'll pick them up later. While I'm now giving the floor to Laura. Laura, you work for the European Investment Fund and especially managing the Creative Europe Guarantee Facility for cultural and creative businesses in Europe. So you have more this financing point of view. You're part of the ecosystem. So yeah, maybe a reaction on this building the ecosystem that you are working on, or any reactions that you may have on Uri's interventions and tips.
Sure. First of all, thanks also from my side for this invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you and listening to all these interesting experience sharing by Uri, but also by Sergiu. Indeed, we are part of the players trying to develop ecosystems in Europe. We are very well aware, unfortunately, that Europe is lagging a bit behind, not a bit, substantially behind US structurally in terms of VC investments. And part of our role is to try and facilitate investments or push or actually put into market more players that can provide finance or invest into the small and medium enterprises of the EU. But I will point out to a comment from Uri that an ecosystem, a successful ecosystem, starts from the talent, and also from, importantly, what Sergiu said, that the entrepreneurs have a role as well to this game of creating an ecosystem, because investors, they invest where there is traction and where there are like proven cases, and where they see the value for investing. So an ecosystem creation starts from having entrepreneurs, success stories. Those entrepreneurs then are themselves most of the times becoming the investors. If we see, for example, on the case of Spotify, so now Spotify is a successful, very successful company themselves, but they are also investing to other companies. So this shows again the cycle of VC. But as a European institution, we have a very important role to play. And through our programs, we're trying to actually facilitate investments and try to make the European investment ecosystem more harmonized, because as Uri said, Europe is not, it is a continent, but it's not a country. And investment activity is happening in different pace in different countries of Europe. So what we are often doing is we are actually being the first investment fund that is created in a country, and following that, more investors are coming into play, or we are acting as anchor investors in funds, so that investments are happening into those sectors like the cultural and creative sectors that are less attractive by investors, because the data are not there, the cases are not proven yet. And so I think our role is very important, but we also need this entrepreneurial mindset in Europe, this mindset that Uri was mentioning, to not give up and complete the mission. From the another point that it was very nicely said by Uri is the importance of having funding, multi-stage funding. Now, at least for the European, in the European Union, in terms of financing ecosystem for CCS, we've launched the very first financial instrument for the support of the cultural and creative sectors 4.5 years ago. And this is supporting debt financing, so loans. And loans are typically given by banks to, let's say, more developed companies that they have already proven themselves and they have some revenue potential. So we are very well aware that we are lacking maybe the early stage funding that is needed for startups to kickstart. And this is something that we will be working on in the future, I hope, to support in Europe. And I hope in the next book of Uri, he can refer to or direct the entrepreneurs to European investors and not to Silicon Valley only. Yes, so from my side, I mean, we know that 1 in 4 entrepreneurs in Europe, they fail to access the financing they need. And it's our role to facilitate this financing. We work with more than 600 banks and 400 investment funds in Europe. We're sharing the risk with them, and we're trying to facilitate investments. And I think Artivive is one of the very, very successful examples that other entrepreneurs in Europe, they should be looking at to also follow their dreams and not shy away from pushing governments or investors to listen to their story and support them. So,
Laura,
yeah,
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question for you, because you know, we have been following development in cultural and creative industries for ages in our company, and we know that the EIB and the EIF became interested in the sector maybe 4 or 5 years ago. What has been the reaction within the institutions to, in a sense of getting into a kind of new market? What has been? Can you tell us a bit the way you have gone through as an institutions or as people, you know, when you started and where you are now, and where do you see the potential compared to maybe other sectors?
First of all, it's always challenging also for us when we're trying to like build and bring into market an instrument that is, let's say, more niche than the generalist instruments we have, or the instruments that are focusing on high tech or fintech. That is, there are markets that they are proven, and we know that demand is there from entrepreneurs as well. When you have to deal with cultural and creative sectors or any other sector that is an emerging sector, it's a process also for us to convince everyone internally that this is something we should start looking at and take concrete actions to support. Because even if demand is not there or the market is not there, it's part of our role to create this market, because as you described before, or Sergio described, it's art, it's changing our lives, is important for society, and so on and so forth. So I think because we are a European institution, we are not focusing on profits. We want to have interventions that they have an impact into society, and as a result, also support jobs and growth, and then profit, and all the financial aspect of it. So it has been challenging initially, but now, and you saw as well yesterday the presentation of the results of the Cultural and Creative Sectors Guarantee Facility. After 4.5 years, we actually managed to showcase to the policymakers and to us internally at the European Investment Fund that it actually made sense to support the cultural and creative sectors, and it has been welcomed by the market, by financial institutions. And thanks to also the capacity building support that you are helping us with, I think the market awareness now is very strong, and financial institutions see the value as well in financial terms of supporting cultural and creative companies, or they started seeing the value. We are at the very first step, I would say. So I think more and more now we are shifting towards this direction of focusing or specializing on sectors that they need more support, like also education and skills, rather than having interventions, broad interventions that covering like all the SMEs, irrespective of sectors, because we saw that when you don't have specific intervention, money are not necessarily going to those sectors that they need most of the support. So I think it has been challenging, but it draws the way towards, paves the way towards where we are going in the future.
Okay, many thanks, Laura. Actually, you said there is a growing awareness, and that now there's, let's say, a communication line on the cultural and creative sectors. We have a question in the chat, going back to what Sergiu was saying about this cultural clash. When pitching an artistic-driven or something that looks like an artistic-driven project to investors in the US. And the question to Sergiu is, did you have a similar experience in Europe? And actually, it's maybe a question for both of you. How to overcome this sort of cultural clash? You partially already answered, Laura, in your comments, but maybe Sergiu?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's, I wouldn't say that it's in the whole US, because obviously it's like 300 million people living there. I think also the difference between the two coasts is big, and also Silicon Valley is a bubble in it, but that's a totally different discussion. I think the moment that there is a cultural clash, as a founder, I have to find a way how I can present what we're doing in a way that they can understand. I think the effort, the moment that as you start a project or a startup, the effort should be on your side to try to somehow pack it in a way that it's easier to relate, to empathize, and understand what you're doing. What we took away, and we learned a lot on the West Coast, in the Silicon Valley time, is that maybe it's not necessarily the venture capital that we're looking for, because the moment that you have venture capital in the company, they will also want something in return, and they will push you towards that. So that's why we actually planned for this year to try to reach out to venture capital on the East Coast in the US, with the hope that there is more understanding of what we're doing and the added value of bringing technology and art together.
I would like to maybe one comment here. I think that we talk about cultural clashes. It really depends on which level we're talking. If we're if we're aiming with a product to the world, there shouldn't be any clash in terms of the solution. So, you know, everybody should know what means to be in a traffic jam, and thus Waze came with the, you know, they challenged reality of other GPSs and came with a social network kind of solution for knowing where the traffic jams are. Cybersecurity, you know, whether it's agriculture or printing food or any other element that the need is international, there shouldn't be any clashes on the product level. I think that one of the things that overcomes some of the presentation level or the packaging level is what I call show, don't tell. It's a much more powerful thing to actually show and demonstrate what you're doing rather than tell about it and describe it. So if you have you know, any kind of solution, whether it's a technological one, whether it's you know, a virtual reality solution that has some kind of a new way to look at art, or any other element, if you can show it, even with an MVP, a minimum viable product, you don't need to develop the whole thing, you don't have to have the full product working, but try to demonstrate it, because usually that overcomes a lot of the cultural differences or the cultural aspects of, you know, the packaging, the presentation, language barriers sometimes, because if the product speaks well, it should be an international kind of talk of the product. And so that's a good way to overcome these challenges sometimes.
In our, you're totally right. And it's what we also did. So we do not have PowerPoints. We're just showing art, and we have some postcards that we take. Some people that maybe have seen know a little bit how amazing it is and how it works. But I think it's like where I had the problem is people talking to people in Silicon Valley is like, why are you in arts? Arts doesn't bring money. Arts doesn't make you rich. Arts is nothing that you would like to pursue. And I think that was the cultural clash that we had, is like explaining to somebody why arts, it's important for humanity, and why we need arts in general. It's a total different way of packaging, and the product that we're having, it's great, and it's on another level, the discussion that we brought.
But by the way, I think you should be very clear if you're a for-profit or non-for-profit. Even the different funding should come from different places, because if you are a for-profit company, obviously there's a lot of money in arts, whether it's museum, whether it's business. So it's not a you know, vertical without money. But if it's a for-profit company, I think it's a legitimate question. What's your business plan? What's your profit? What would be the multiple on the investments, and these kind of questions. If it's a non-for-profit, that's it's a different kind of pitch and a different kind of funding.
Sure, we had all of that, and we have a revenue, so we bootstrapped for a long time, and we're doing actually very good. Right. But the question is like, because I'm coming from marketing, and we did the same thing in marketing, everybody was like, oh, you know what, advertising, there's a lot of money in advertising. And I tried to explain this, people will not actively consume advertising. It's like people will not download an app and look at advertising. Advertising is disturbing. And then the whole discussion is shifting in a way where it's still a cultural clash, because trying to say that there is money in arts, and not all artists are starving, and there are museums and there are people who are investing in this space, and it's also something to look. It's yeah, shifting from the product and the idea to change the world. That's what was in our experience, but I'm sure that we learned a lot and we can do it also better. But I think, I don't know how much time you spent in Silicon Valley. It's a total different world, I would say.
Yeah, you mentioned it. It's kind of a bubble. I agree, but I don't think. Again, I don't think the Silicon Valley it's the only place you can fundraise, and I think there's if you're in a certain vertical like arts, like fashion. There's fashion tech. There's food tech. There's music tech. There's a lot of tech. You know, Spotify is it's a brilliant company. It's about music. Obviously, Apple Music and is doing very well as well. So I think that if you need to define what is it that you're doing, and if you have a competitive advantage, whether it's a technological one, whether it's a conceptual one. You know, industries have been shifted. You know, Airbnb transformed the whole hospitality business, and it wasn't a technology play, it was a conceptual play. Same with Uber. Yeah, they have technology to support it, but there wasn't a special algorithm or something. Uber the same. They transformed the whole transportation business, and there's other examples of very large businesses that had the right concept at the right timing and answered the right need. And I think that definitely cultural concepts and cultural needs are being changed and need to address in a different way. And that's probably how you should address it.
Yeah, I was just talking about the cultural clash, and that's why, like you said, Silicon Valley is maybe not the right part to search for VCs.
True.
And that's why we moved to the East Coast, where we have all the great museums and art galleries and artists. But I think it was like the whole discussion started with cultural clash, that some things can be solved in packaging and presenting, and other things are maybe because we weren't at the right time at the right place.
Talking maybe about about being at the right time at the right place, we have a question maybe quickly before we are heading to the end of this discussion, which is getting really warm. We have a question still for you, Sergiu, about what you think is your biggest success in developing your company or your initial idea.
So I think it's exactly also what Uri said, is like changing status quo, taking a technology and putting it to work in an idea. I mentioned it at the beginning, the way how we create in general arts and how arts is displayed and how people are interacting with arts is more or less the same how my grandparents were, which in a way is good because it's parts of the culture and it should be preserved. But for the younger generations and generations also in my age, they want to experience art maybe in a different way. And we have so many great creatives and digital artists which are trapped in the digital space. And what we're trying to do is bring them to the museums, bring them to the galleries. And I think this is what helped us to just say, okay, we have a big idea. We want to upgrade and update how art is created and consumed.
Thanks a lot, Sergiu. Many thanks to Uri and to Laura as well. Maybe if Uri, you want to say a word before we come to the conclusions and the wrap up of this session, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just I want to thank you. I can be approached if everybody wants through LinkedIn. I'm active there. There's a website called theunstoppablestartup.com. You can reach me there as well. So by all means, if you want to chat or continue the discussion or have any questions, I'll be happy to. I'm available.